want you to close your eyes for a second if you can, and just, imagine being a young man living in the province of Canton, China.
Right.
The year is 1849. And all around you, the mighty Qing Empire it's visibly, violently fracturing.
Yeah, it really is.
You're living through this crushing weight of internal civil wars, widespread, devastating famines that have literally turned the soil to dust.
Yeah, the conditions are just unimaginable.
And on top of that, you have the deep, bitter humiliation of foreign European powers, like actively carving up your homeland in the wake of the Opium Wars.
Exactly.
So you're desperate, your family is hungry, and then this man approaches you in the street, a recruiter. He tells you a story about a place across the ocean. He offers you a piece of paper, a work contract for an 8-year stint in a faraway land that he translates as the country of Golden Hills.
The country of Golden Hills. Wow.
Right. And that land is actually Peru. He promises that with just, a little bit of elbow grease, you can become rich enough to save your entire family.
It sounds like a dream.
So you take the brush, you sign the paper, but what you absolutely do not know in that exact moment is that you haven't secured your future.
No, not at all.
You've just sold your own physical freedom, stepping into this terrifying machine that's going to transport you 9,000 miles across the Pacific.
It is, it's a profoundly chilling image to start with because, we aren't just talking about the tragic fate of one single man here.
Right.
We are looking at the ignition point of one of the most significant yet incredibly overlooked mass migrations in modern history.
Yeah, it's wild how few people actually know about this.
It really is. I mean, This is a migration that would forever alter the trajectory, the economy, and like the very genetic makeup of a nation sitting completely on the other side of the planet.
So, welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to completely uncover the hidden history of this forced migration.
Exactly.
We're going to explore how a desperate influx of men from the crumbling Qing Empire ended up fundamentally engineering the DNA and the culture of modern Peru.
And to really put the stakes of this into perspective right now, for you listening, we have to look at the demographic reality of Peru today.
Yeah, let's hit them with the numbers because it's mind-blowing.
The demographic reality is staggering. Today, more than 175 years after that first young man signed his life away, it's estimated that between 10 and 15% of all living Peruvians have Chinese ancestry.
10 to 15%.
Yeah. We are talking about anywhere from 1 to 3 million people.
I mean, 10 to 15% of the entire population. When we think of Peruvian culture globally, the immediate associations are usually, the ancient Incas.
Right, Machu Picchu.
Yeah, the ruins of Machu Picchu, the legacy of the Spanish conquest, or the rich indigenous heritage in the Andes. But this massive, vibrant, foundational pillar of Chinese heritage is just woven directly into the daily fabric of the country.
Absolutely, it's foundational.
So to truly understand this massive cultural fusion, we have to understand how we actually get to that 15%.
Right.
We have to travel back in time to the middle of the 19th century and really examine the sheer economic panic that set this massive human supply chain in motion.
And to grasp that panic, we really need to examine the incredibly fragile economic foundations of the Peruvian state at that exact moment.
Set the scene for us.
Well, Peru had declared its independence from the Spanish Empire in 1821. So it was a brand new republic.
Right.
They had successfully thrown off the colonial yoke, drafted a constitution, raised a new flag, all of that.
So they're free.
In theory, yes. However, that shiny new republic was built on a crumbling foundation. The economy was still entirely reliant on the exact same systems of forced labor that the Spanish had, meticulously constructed over centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this because this feels like the crucial domino.
It is.
They have this new identity as a free republic, but the actual engine keeping the lights on, like the mechanism generating the wealth, is still chattel slavery.
That is the core contradiction of early Peruvian independence. The grand coastal plantations, these massive, sprawling haciendas that grew cotton and sugarcane in the fertile river valleys, carving through the coastal desert. They were the undisputed lifeblood of the Peruvian agricultural export economy.
Right.
And those vast estates were worked almost entirely by enslaved people of African descent.
Wow. So they just kept it going.
Yeah. The new republic simply inherited this brutal system and kept it running. Economically speaking, the wealthy landowning elite, the hacendados, they couldn't even conceptualize a system of agricultural production that functioned by like paying a fair wage to free men.
It just wasn't in their worldview.
Exactly. Forced labor was their absolute status quo.
But the status quo always shatters eventually.
Right.
And that shattering happens on a very specific pivotal date, December 3rd, 1854. This is when the Peruvian president, Ramon Castilla, formally and finally abolishes slavery in Peru.
A huge moment.
Now, on a human level, this is obviously a monumental act of historical justice. It's a moment of profound liberation. But for the people holding the purse strings, for those elite plantation owners, this was a 5-alarm fire.
Oh, it was perceived as an absolute economic apocalypse.
Really?
Yeah, the wealthy hacendados suddenly woke up to this terrifying reality. They possessed these vast expanses of highly fertile land. They had thousands of acres of sugarcane and cotton just ready to be cultivated and harvested, and they had absolutely zero hands to do the physical work.
Because everyone just left, right?
Naturally. The formerly enslaved population quite naturally and immediately abandoned the plantations. I mean, those lands were the sites of their generational trauma, their torture, their bondage.
You wouldn't stick around.
No way. They migrated to the cities, they formed their own independent communities, and they categorically refused to return to the field under the same abusive overseers, no matter what meager wage was suddenly being offered.
I want to frame this for you, the listener, in a way that captures the sheer paralyzing scale of this panic among the elite.
Mm-hmm.
Think about a massive overnight supply chain collapse in the modern era. Imagine if, like tomorrow morning, every single truck driver, cargo ship captain, and warehouse logistics worker on Earth just vanished from their posts simultaneously.
That's a great analogy.
Right. The physical goods are still sitting in the warehouses, the consumer demand is still raging, but the physical mechanism to actually move the product is completely gone.
Yeah, you're paralyzed.
And that kind of desperate 0-hour scenario, industries will resort to extreme, unprecedented, and often incredibly predatory measures just to survive.
Absolutely.
And that was the Peruvian agricultural sector in 1854. They were staring down the barrel of total systemic financial ruin.
And, that impending ruin would have been devastating enough on its own, but there was another layer to this economic perfect storm.
Oh, right. The discovery.
Yeah, because right around this exact same time, the Peruvian state had stumbled upon what seemed like an absolute miracle of nature. They had discovered a source of wealth so vast, so incredibly lucrative, that it almost defies modern belief.
It sounds made up.
It really does. And it was located entirely on these barren, rocky islands just off their coast.
We are talking, of course, about bird excrement, guano.
Guano. I know it sounds trivial to modern ears, but we have to understand the chemistry and the historical context here.
Okay, lay it on us.
For thousands of years, massive colonies of seabirds, primarily the guane cormorant, the Peruvian booby, and the brown pelican, they had been using these rocky coastal islands as their nesting and breeding grounds.
Mm-hmm.
And the Humboldt Current brings incredibly nutrient-rich water up the coast, which feeds millions of fish, which in turn feed millions of birds.
Right, it's a huge ecosystem.
Exactly. And because the coastal climate of Peru is so incredibly arid, it practically never rains on these islands, the droppings of these birds simply accumulated.
It's just built up over time.
Layer upon layer, century after century, just baking in the sun. Over millennia, it formed these towering mountains of solid guano, sometimes reaching over 100 feet deep.
100 feet deep of bird poop. It's just hard to visualize an economy built on that. But this wasn't just dirt. This was essentially a geological anomaly.
It was pure, highly concentrated nitrogen and phosphorus. It was, without exaggeration, the most potent, most effective natural agricultural fertilizer the world had ever seen.
Wow.
And we have to look at the global context here. In the mid-19th century, right before the invention of synthetic chemical fertilizers, European and North American agriculture was facing a terrifying crisis of soil depletion.
Oh, because they'd over-farmed everything.
Exactly. Intensive farming had stripped the nutrients from the earth. Crop yields were plummeting, and there were genuine fears of mass starvation in Europe.
That's terrifying.
And then suddenly, Peru announces to the world that they have literal mountains of this miracle powder that makes crops explode with unprecedented growth.
So the demand was just instant.
Instantaneous and insatiable. It triggered the guano boom. Guano rapidly became the nation's #1 export, and the revenues were so massive that they practically propped up the entire national budget of Peru for decades.
So the state is sitting on mountains of literal gold. It's the answer to all their prayers. But there is a massive glaring logistical problem.
Oh, yeah.
You have to actually get it off the islands. You have to mine it.
And the process of mining grano was arguably one of the most infernal, brutal, soul-crushing forms of labor ever devised.
Paint a picture for us. How bad was it?
Well, these islands were barren rocks baking under a relentless, blistering equatorial sun. There was no fresh water, there was no shade.
Sounds like a nightmare.
And the smell of the concentrated ammonia was so overwhelmingly thick that it would chemically burn your eyes and sear your throat with every single breath.
Oh my God.
The dust, which was as fine as powdered glass, would coat the workers' lungs, leading to horrific respiratory diseases. It was just back-breaking physical labor.
Right.
Men had to hack away at this solidified, concrete-like excrement with iron pickaxes, load the heavy chunks into wheelbarrows, and push them up and down these treacherous gangplanks to waiting ships.
And nobody wants to do that.
No free person in their right mind would ever voluntarily choose to do this work, certainly not for the pitiful wages the state and the private contractors were willing to pay.
So we have a complete labor vacuum on the massive coastal sugar and cotton plantations, and we have a desperate, urgent need for disposable bodies to mine the guano islands just to keep the entire national economy afloat.
Right.
The state and the wealthy elite are in full panic mode. They need a solution, and they need it yesterday.
And what's fascinating here is how deliberately they looked outward for a solution. They didn't look inward to reform their own labor practices.
Of course not.
No, they didn't consider offering higher wages or better conditions to attract the local indigenous or mestizo populations. Instead, they looked across the globe.
What did they find?
They observed what the British and the French empires were doing in their Caribbean colonies following the abolition of slavery there.
Aha.
The European powers had pioneered a system of using coolies. These were contracted laborers, primarily brought over from Asia to fill the physical void left by emancipated slaves.
Wow.
And the Peruvian government and the elite hacendados, they saw this Caribbean model not as a horrifying human rights violation, but as the perfect legal loophole.
A legal loophole for human suffering?
Essentially, yes.
Huh.
It was a bureaucratic mechanism to legally replace slavery with a system of semi-slavery, thereby saving their profit margins and keeping the state's guano-dependent budget in the black.
That's exactly what it was. And the mechanism to formally enact this loophole arrived in the form of a law passed on November 18th, 1849.
The Ley Chinesca.
Right. The Peruvian Congress promulgated the general immigration law. But on the streets and in the halls of power, everybody colloquially knew it as the Ley Chinesca, the Chinese law. And we need to be very clear about this. This wasn't some broad, open arms immigration policy inviting people to come build a life.
Not at all.
This was a highly targeted, incredibly lucrative business arrangement muscled through Congress by a very wealthy landowner named Domingo Elias and his business partner, Juan Rodriguez.
And Domingo Elias was a towering figure in mid-19th century Peru. He was a rich hacendado from the Ica region, deeply embedded in both the political machinery and the economic elite.
So he had a lot of pull?
He had massive influence. He felt the sting of the labor shortage acutely on his own estates, but he also possessed the dark foresight to see the immense opportunity for personal profit.
Right.
By pushing this specific law through the legislature, Elias and his partner Rodriguez essentially secured for themselves a state-sanctioned monopoly.
A monopoly on people.
Exactly. The law granted them the exclusive right for a period of 4 years to import Chinese workers into the vital agricultural departments of Lima and La Libertad.
The language itself is such a giveaway. To import workers. They're using the exact same terminology one would use for importing machinery or textiles or livestock. They completely commodified human beings, but they wrapped it up in this neat, civilized, legalistic bow of a contract.
It's chilling.
They built the legal framework required to restart the machinery of forced labor without technically calling it slavery.
So the legal and economic foundations were poured. The state had given its official blessing, the wealthy elite had their mechanism, and the monopoly was secured.
Right.
The only thing left to do is to physically cross the globe and acquire the bodies necessary to feed this newly built economic engine.
Which brings us to the harrowing human reality of how this law was actually executed on the ground. We're moving away from the sterile, bureaucratic halls of the Peruvian Congress and traveling to the chaotic docks of Macau and the dark, suffocating holds of the Trans-Pacific ships.
The first wave.
Exactly. We're entering the era of the first wave, the era of the pig ships.
And the historical record pinpoints a very specific date that marks the dawn of this era, October 15th, 1849.
What happened that day?
This is the day a Danish-flagged vessel, the Frederick Wilhelmsen, finally dropped anchor at the main port of Callao in Peru.
Just try to visualize the absolute exhaustion of this arrival. The Frederick Wilhelmsen had sailed from the port of Macau, which at the time was a Portuguese colony clinging to the southern coast of China.
Right.
It had traversed nearly 9,000 miles across the vast, unforgiving, often violent expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and the journey took 120 days.
4 straight months.
4 straight months trapped at sea. And when the gangplank was finally lowered onto the docks of Callao, 75 Chinese immigrants stepped off into a world they couldn't possibly comprehend.
Yeah.
They were the very first human beings to set foot on Peruvian soil under this new industrialized system.
And those 75 men on the docks of Callao were just the vanguard. They were a tiny trickle that would very rapidly swell into a massive human tide.
How big did it?
The sheer scale of the operation over the next quarter century is monumental. Between 1849 and 1874, it's estimated that between 80,000 and 100,000 Chinese workers were brought into the ports of Peru.
100,000 people.
Yeah.
In an era before mechanized steel ships, before the Panama Canal, that is a staggering logistical undertaking built entirely on human trafficking.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
And we need to look closely at the demographic profile of these 100,000 people because it tells you exactly what this system was designed to extract.
Right.
These were not families. These were almost entirely men, young men. They ranged in age from as young as 10 years old, literal children, up to maybe 40.
Heartbreaking.
And it came overwhelmingly from a very specific geographic region, the province of Guangdong, historically referred to as Canton, in southern China.
And the fact that they were almost exclusively young men drawn from one specific chaotic region speaks volumes about the highly predatory nature of the recruitment process.
Because of what was happening in China at the time?
Exactly. We have to circle back to the image you painted at the very beginning of our discussion. The Qing Empire was in a state of terminal decline.
Right.
The Opium Wars had utterly ravaged the economy and shattered the central government's authority. There were massive internal rebellions, horrific starvation, and profound, widespread desperation.
Just total chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah.
And this socio-political collapse made the southern coast of China incredibly fertile hunting ground for the recruiters.
And the historical sources give us the specific, highly derogatory nickname used for these recruiters in the slang of the era. They were called pig herders.
Pig herders.
That phrase alone tells you everything you need to know about how they viewed the human beings they were dealing with. So how exactly did these pig herders operate? How do you manipulate 100,000 men into boarding a ship bound for the other side of the earth?
It was an intricate web of deep deception and highly coercive mechanics. The pig herders preyed entirely on extreme vulnerability.
Finding the most desperate people.
Always. They stalked the ports and the famine-struck villages looking for men who were drowning in insurmountable gambling debt, men who were literally running for their lives from local warlords or clan violence.
Wow.
Or simply young men whose families were starving to death and who harbored a desperate, blinding hope for a better future.
So how did they trap them?
The mechanics of the trap usually involved an advance payment. The recruiter would offer a sum of silver directly to the family. In times of severe famine, turning down that silver was a death sentence for the parents and siblings.
So it was an impossible choice.
Completely impossible to refuse. But in exchange for that silver, the young man had to sign a contract.
And this piece of paper, this contract, is the absolute crux of the whole deception.
It really is.
The paper explicitly stated that the laborer agreed to work for a period of 8 years. In return, their passage across the ocean was fully paid for. They would receive basic daily food and clothing rations, and they would be paid a minimal but theoretically guaranteed monthly salary. On paper, to someone starving in the streets of Canton, it might have sounded like a harsh but ultimately fair trade. Give up 8 years of your youth to hard labor, save your family from starvation, and build a nest egg to return home with.
The tragedy is that the reality was a horrific bait and switch. We must remember that many of these young men were completely illiterate.
Oh.
They couldn't even read the characters on the document they were pressing their ink-stained thumbs onto. They signed under extreme duress, fueled by sheer economic terror.
They didn't know what they were agreeing to.
And the very moment they were herded aboard those ships, the illusion of a fair, reciprocal labor agreement vanished entirely.
Wait, I have to stop you there and push back on this because I know the listener is likely wondering the exact same thing.
Sure.
If they sign a legally binding document, a contract that explicitly promised a salary, rations, and return passage after 8 years, How does the government look at that and say, yes, this is totally fine, this isn't slavery? I mean, a contract implies mutual consent and legal boundaries, right? How did this actually function as semi-slavery in practice?
That is the exact legal gray area the Peruvian elite exploited. They weaponized the concept of a legal document to completely strip away human agency.
How so?
The key to understanding this is the power dynamic on the ground and the absolute lack of enforcement of the workers' theoretical rights.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the nature of the contracts themselves. They were fully transferable.
Transferable.
Yes. The Chinese worker didn't sign an agreement to work for a specific farmer or a specific company. They signed a contract with the recruiter or the shipping syndicate.
Ah.
So when those ships arrived in the port of Callao, the human cargo was essentially paraded onto the auction block. The contracts, and by extension the men attached to them, were sold and transferred directly to the highest bidding plantation owner or guano contractor.
Wow. So the worker had absolutely zero say in where they went, what climate they were sent to, or who held the power of life and death over them.
Zero.
They could be bought by a relatively pragmatic farmer in a mild coastal valley, or they could be bought by a sadistic, violently abusive overseer on the ammonia-choked Guano Islands.
And they had absolutely no legal recourse to object.
None at all.
None whatsoever. Once they were assigned to a hacienda or an island, they were geographically trapped. They could not move freely. They were confined to the property, often locked in crowded barracks at night called galpones, which were heavily guarded.
Basically a prison.
It was. Furthermore, the supposed salary they received was a cruel joke. Historical records note that a coolie earned barely half the wage of a free worker performing the exact same tasks.
If they even got paid in real money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even that meager fractional salary was almost never paid in actual currency. It was paid in scrip company money or stamped tokens that could only be spent at the plantation store.
The classic company store trap.
Exactly. The plantation owners controlled the prices of everything. If a worker needed an extra ration of rice or medicine or a replacement for a broken tool, they had to buy it from the owner at vastly inflated prices using this worthless scrip.
That's insidious.
This created a deliberate cycle of debt peonage. They were constantly mathematically in debt to their owners just to afford basic survival.
Let's follow that logic to its grim conclusion. What happens when those magical 8 years are finally up?
Right.
You've survived the brutal conditions, you haven't died of disease, you've served your time, you are legally a free man, all right?
In theory, yes. In practice, the system was entirely rigged against them. The hacendados wielded immense, unquestioned local political power.
So they just made up the rules.
Pretty much. When a contract finally expired, the owner would frequently summon the worker and present them with a heavily fabricated, insurmountable bill for expenses incurred over the past 8 years.
Unbelievable.
Charges for medical care when they were injured on the job, charges for broken shovels, massive debts accumulated at the overpriced company store.
And they couldn't pay it.
Since the worker obviously couldn't pay this fabricated debt, the owner would simply force a contract renewal. They would physically or legally coerce the man into signing for another 4 or 8 years to work off the debt.
And there's no one they can complain to.
If the coolie tried to appeal to the law, the local magistrates, the judges, and the police chiefs were the friends, cousins, and peers of the plantation owners. They always sided with the elite.
It's a closed loop.
The coolie had no voice in the legal system. They were trapped in a cycle of perpetual servitude that mirrored the chattel slavery of the previous era in everything but name.
And we haven't even detailed the horror of the journey over yet. The source material refers to the vessels used in this trans-Pacific trade as pig ships.
Yeah, the pig ships.
We note the journey took about 120 days, 4 months of open ocean. What were the actual physical conditions like inside those hulls?
They were floating hellscapes. The shipping companies were paid a bounty per head, delivered alive to Callao. But to maximize their profit margins, they packed as many human beings as physically, mathematically possible into the dark holds of the ships.
I can't even imagine.
The conditions were deplorable and deeply unsanitary. Imagine hundreds of men crammed below decks, chained or confined to tiny wooden bunks, with minimal ventilation in the sweltering tropical heat.
And the food?
The rations were inadequate, often spoiled water and rotting rice. Disease ran rampant in the dark. Scurvy, dysentery, and cholera outbreaks were terrifyingly common.
So a lot of them didn't even make it.
The mortality rates during these crossings were shockingly high. Men who started the journey relatively healthy in Macau would arrive in Callao emaciated, violently ill, or gravely injured from the constant pitching of the ship.
God.
Many simply didn't survive the voyage at all. Their bodies were thrown overboard into the Pacific. It was a brutal, extended physical and psychological trauma before the real work on the land even began.
So the men who actually survived this 4-month nightmare ocean crossing arrive in Peru. They are weak, disoriented, and their contracts are immediately auctioned off to the highest bidder.
Right.
Where exactly did these 80,000 to 100,000 men end up working? Because they weren't just isolated in one sector, they were systematically plugged into the entire infrastructure of the country.
They were distributed across several key foundational sectors of the Peruvian economy, and their labor fundamentally transformed those sectors overnight.
Where did most of them go?
The vast majority were sent directly to the coastal agricultural plantations. The massive haciendas growing cotton and sugarcane in northern and central regions like Ica, Lima, La Libertad, and Lambayeque were suddenly flooded with Chinese workers.
And that completely changed the economy, right?
The economic impact of injecting tens of thousands of forced laborers into the system was immediate and astronomical.
I want to highlight a specific statistic from the historical data that really drives the scale of this boom home.
Let's hear it.
We are looking at the sugar industry. In 1871, Peru's total national sugar production was a relatively modest 4,500 tons. Just 6 years later, by 1877, that production had exploded to 63,370 tons.
Wow.
That is a 14-fold increase in half a decade.
That's insane.
That kind of exponential growth doesn't happen by magic, and it doesn't happen through better farming techniques alone. That happens because an army of desperate men is working back-breaking 14-hour days under the constant threat of the overseer's whip to clear the land, plant the cane, harvest it by hand with machetes, and process it in the boiling houses.
It was a massive industrial agricultural boom, fueled entirely by the blood and sweat of the coolies. But agriculture was only one piece of the economic puzzle.
Great, we have to talk about the guano again.
We must return our focus to the Guano Islands, specifically the Chincha Islands. Thousands of Chinese laborers were sent there, and the conditions on those islands were universally acknowledged as the worst of all.
Worse than the plantations.
Yes, they were entirely isolated from the mainland, surrounded by treacherous currents, leaving them completely at the mercy of overseers, whose only financial incentive was to extract the maximum daily tonnage of fertilizer.
With no oversight.
The physical abuse was rampant, the air was toxic, and the despair was absolute. The historical records note that the suicide rates among Chinese workers on the Guano Islands were tragically, horrifically high.
Oh, man.
For many men pushed past the absolute limits of human endurance, throwing themselves off the jagged cliffs into the Pacific Ocean was the only logical way to escape the unending torture.
It is incredibly bleak to contemplate. And yet, the state and the economy kept demanding more bodies because they didn't just need them to grow crops and mine fertilizer. They needed them for modernization.
Right.
They needed them to build the infrastructure of the future, the railroad.
Yes, the late 19th century was the era of the great railroad boom globally, and Peru was desperate to join that modern era.
They had big plans.
The government had an incredibly ambitious vision to connect the coastal capital of Lima with the massive, resource-rich mining regions in the interior of the country. But to do that, they had to lay track straight across the towering, treacherous, freezing peaks of the Andes Mountains.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
The coolies were drafted by the thousands into this incredibly dangerous construction work. They weren't just laying ties on flat ground. They were dangling from ropes to blast tunnels through solid granite at dizzying altitudes, laying track over terrifying gorges, and working in freezing temperatures they had never experienced in southern China.
The casualties must have been awful.
The casualty rates from dynamite accidents, rock falls, and sheer exposure to the elements were devastating.
And finally, the records showed that a significant number were also absorbed into the major urban centers, primarily Lima and the port of Callao, working in domestic service. They became cooks, house servants, and menial laborers for the urban elite. This is a crucial detail because it means they slowly began to weave themselves into the daily visual and cultural fabric of Peruvian city life, rather than just being hidden away on distant islands or remote plantations.
That visibility is key.
Yeah.
From the freezing highest peaks of the Andes laying steel rails, to the sweltering coastal valleys swinging machetes in the cane fields, to the foul-smelling, toxic guano islands, to the pristine kitchens of Lima's elite mansions.
We were everywhere.
The Chinese coolie was the undeniable physical engine driving Peruvian progress in the 19th century.
Now, when we discuss a history like this, a history of such systemic, overwhelming, state-sanctioned oppression, it is very easy to fall into the narrative trap of viewing these men purely as passive victims.
Oh, absolutely.
Just nameless cogs fed into a cruel machine. But the actual historical record tells a very different, much more defiant story. These men fought back, they resisted, and they resisted fiercely.
They absolutely did. The narrative of the docile, naturally submissive coolie is a deliberate racist myth perpetuated by the elites of the time to justify the brutality of the system.
Right.
The reality on the ground was vastly different. The history of this era is heavily punctuated by numerous violent uprisings, strikes, and full-scale rebellions.
Yeah.
The workers did not simply bow their heads and accept their fate.
The sources highlight several major coordinated flashpoints of resistance.
Yeah.
There was a massive rebellion in Patavilca in 1870. Another major uprising followed in Huacho in 1875. And yet another significant revolt in Trujillo in 1876.
These weren't small events.
We aren't talking about minor scuffles or a few guys refusing to work. These were highly coordinated, desperate insurrections. Workers utilized whatever they had, turning their heavy agricultural tools, their machetes and axes, into weapons of war.
Wow.
They rose up against their overseers, burned the plantation infrastructure, and actively attempted to seize physical control of the haciendas.
And we must deeply consider the incredible courage it took to launch these rebellions. The Chinese workers were completely isolated on these rural estates. They were heavily outgunned, facing overseers armed with rifles.
It was a suicide mission in a way.
And most importantly, they were facing a unified state apparatus, the military and the local militias, that was deeply financially invested in maintaining the status quo of forced labor.
So the response was brutal.
When these rebellions inevitably occurred, the response from the Peruvian military was swift, overwhelming, and exceptionally brutal. The uprisings were crushed with military force, and the ringleaders were often executed publicly.
To send a message.
Yes, their bodies displayed to serve as a gruesome, terrifying warning to any other workers contemplating defiance. But even though they were militarily defeated, these rebellions are crucial historical markers.
Why is that?
They unequivocally reveal the active, burning resistance of men who categorically refused to accept their dehumanization as permanent or justified.
And resistance wasn't always a violent clash of arms. Not everyone could take up a machete and charge a man with a rifle. For many, resistance took quieter but equally dangerous forms.
Right.
Thousands simply ran away. They fled the heavily guarded haciendas in the dead of night, disappearing into the vast, complex geography of Peru. They tried to blend into remote indigenous communities in the highlands, or they made their way to the chaotic urban centers to live in hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders. But beyond physical escape, there was also a much deeper, more profound type of resistance, a resistance of the spirit and the mind.
You're referring to cultural retention.
Exactly.
Yes, from a sociological standpoint, this is perhaps the most powerful, enduring form of daily resistance. When absolutely everything physical is stripped from you, your freedom of movement, your labor, your physical safety, the only territory you truly control is your mind, your identity, and your culture.
That's really powerful.
The coolies fiercely resisted psychological assimilation by guarding their heritage. They maintained their language, continuing to speak Cantonese in the dark of the barracks. They practiced their religious rituals and ancestral beliefs in secret.
And the food.
And, crucially, they preserved their culinary traditions. Every single time they managed to improvise a traditional meal using substitute local ingredients, they were silently asserting their humanity, their history, and their dignity.
They were openly defying a system explicitly designed to reduce them to mindless tools.
Absolutely.
And this intensely simmering landscape, a landscape defined by brutal forced labor and constant simmering resistance, suddenly collides with a massive geopolitical earthquake.
The War of the Pacific.
War of the Pacific. This massive conflict raged from 1879 to 1884, pitting the allied forces of Peru and Bolivia against the invading forces of Chile over disputes regarding mineral-rich territories.
Right.
And the Chinese laborers found themselves caught right in the middle of the crossfire.
It was a chaotic, deeply complex, and violent situation. The war physically tore through the territory of Peru. As the heavily armed Chilean expeditionary forces advanced northward up the Peruvian coast, they inevitably encountered these vast agricultural haciendas populated by thousands of enslaved Chinese workers.
There is a very specific historical event here that the records emphasize, primarily because it has been historically misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented for political reasons.
Yes.
In September of 1880, a Chilean captain named Patricio Lynch was leading a major expeditionary force along the northern coast, engaging in sabotage and resource denial against the Peruvian state. During this campaign, Lynch's forces actively liberated thousands of Chinese workers who were being held in servitude on the sugar plantations. And the historical controversy stems from the fact that a significant number of these newly freed Chinese workers then turned around and actively collaborated with the invading Chilean forces.
Yes, is a crucial point that requires very careful, nuanced analysis, stripping away nationalistic bias.
Okay, let's break it down.
For decades, traditional nationalist histories taught in Peru painted these Chinese workers as despicable traitors to the nation. They were heavily vilified for aiding the enemy during a time of national crisis.
Which is wild.
But if we actually analyze the power dynamics and the horrific lived reality of these men, that nationalist narrative completely disintegrates.
Right. It's a completely absurd expectation. How can you possibly be a traitor to a nation that explicitly refuses to recognize you as a citizen?
Exactly.
A nation that actively built the legal framework to sanction your enslavement, that arms the men who beat you, and that legally denies you the most basic human rights? You don't owe that state an ounce of allegiance.
Precisely the point. We must frame their participation in the War of the Pacific not as a matter of geopolitical loyalty or ideological treason, but as a deeply rational, incredibly pragmatic choice for sheer physical survival.
It's just survival.
When the heavily armed Chilean army arrived, dismantled the plantation security, and offered them immediate freedom from the whip in the cane fields, they logically took it. Furthermore, their collaboration with the Chileans was almost entirely in auxiliary and logistical roles. They acted as local guides who knew the terrain, they dug trenches, they managed complex supply lines, and they cared for horses.
So they weren't fighting for Chile.
No, they weren't fighting on the front lines against the Peruvian army out of some deep-seated ideological hatred for Peru. They were simply attaching themselves to the only military force in the region that possessed the power and the willingness to permanently shatter their chains.
It was a desperate, calculated grab for liberty in a chaotic, shifting landscape.
Exactly.
It's an incredible story of survival through sheer pragmatism. But the war wasn't the only existential threat to the coolie system. Because while these men were navigating war zones and fighting for their lives on the ground, a totally different kind of battle was brewing in the international arena.
Right, diplomacy.
Which brings us to a monumental shift in the timeline. We've examined the legal framework. We have detailed the horrific human reality. Now, how does a deeply entrenched, highly profitable system of forced labor actually come to an end?
Well, history shows us that these systems very rarely end, because the people profiting from them suddenly develop a moral conscience.
Very rarely. The profits are simply too high.
Yes. In this specific case, the end did not come from domestic goodwill, progressive legislation, or a sudden moral awakening among the Peruvian elite. It came from unprecedented, sustained, and intense international pressure.
From where?
And specifically, it came directly from the very place the workers originated from, the Qing Empire.
This is where the story takes a fascinating, high-stakes diplomatic turn, because you might naturally assume that the Qing Emperor, sitting thousands of miles away in the Forbidden City in Beijing, desperately trying to manage his own collapsing empire, had absolutely no idea what was happening to these poor farmers in the coastal deserts of Peru.
Right.
But he absolutely did. Intelligence reached the imperial court. The emperor was fully, grimly aware of the systemic abuse, the deceptive contracts, the horrors of the pig ships, and the death camps on the Guano Islands.
And he wasn't just passively aware.
No, he was furious. The Qing government had begun filing formal, aggressive diplomatic complaints against the Peruvian state.
And this escalating anger put Peru in a very precarious, vulnerable position on the world stage.
How so?
Well, Peru was a young republic desperately trying to project an image of a modern, civilized, law-abiding nation engaged in legitimate global trade.
But the reality was very different.
Right. And the broader international community, particularly the dominant European powers that had ostensibly outlawed the transatlantic slave trade decades earlier, were watching the Peruvian coolie system with increasing distaste and alarm.
It was bad luck.
The sheer brutality of the scandal was becoming a massive stain on Peru's international reputation, and crucially, it was threatening to isolate them and damage their ability to conduct vital business globally.
So the Peruvian government realizes they have a massive escalating public relations crisis on their hands, not to mention a very real, legitimate diplomatic rift with the massive Chinese empire.
Yeah, they had to act.
In 1874, the Peruvian president, Manuel Pardo y Lavalle, decides he has to fix this immediately before it damages the economy further. He makes the bold decision to send a formal diplomatic mission directly to China to negotiate.
Right.
And the man he chooses for this incredibly delicate, high-wire task is a naval captain and seasoned diplomat named Aurelio Garcia y Garcia.
And Captain Garcia y Garcia was handed what amounted to an almost impossibly complex double mission.
What were his orders?
First, he had to somehow smooth over the immense justified imperial anger regarding the decades of trafficking and horrific abuse of Chinese subjects. He had to essentially stand before the king officials, apologize for the atrocities, and offer a legally binding resolution to the coolie scandal.
Not an easy conversation.
No. Second, and perhaps even more difficult, he was tasked with establishing formal, permanent diplomatic and trade relations between the young Republic of Peru and the ancient empire of the Great King.
Let's just pause and marvel at the sheer mind-boggling logistical nightmare of trying to conduct high-stakes international diplomacy in the year 1874.
Oh, it's wild.
We are talking about an era before telegrams could easily or reliably cross the Pacific Ocean, before air travel, before instant translation headsets.
Right.
You have a Peruvian naval captain sailing for months to reach China, trying to negotiate with highly educated imperial officials from a vastly different, deeply ancient culture across a massive linguistic barrier.
The potential for catastrophic cultural misunderstandings alone could have derailed the whole mission on day one.
It was an incredibly delicate, incredibly frustrating dance of protocol.
In fact, the cultural and linguistic divide was so vast that Peru and China couldn't even negotiate directly with one another at first. The friction was too high.
So what did they do?
They required the active mediation of three major global powers, the United States, France, and Great Britain.
Seriously?
Yes. These Western diplomats had to step in and physically facilitate the dialogue, painstakingly translating not just the spoken language, but deeply complex legal concepts and cultural expectations between the two vastly different parties.
It's essentially a 19th century version of a high-stakes UN summit, but it's happening at a glacial pace over months and months of incredibly slow, painstaking negotiation, with messages taking weeks to clarify.
Yeah.
But somehow, against all odds and logistical barriers, Captain Garcia y Garcia manages to pull it off.
You really did.
On June 26, 1874, in the city of Tientsin, which we know today as Tianjin, the delegations sign a document that changes the course of history for both nations. The historic Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between the Republic of Peru and His Majesty the Emperor of China.
And we simply cannot overstate how monumental this treaty was, not just for the immediate relationship between Peru and China, but for the broader scope of global diplomatic history.
It was a first, wasn't it?
First of all, it broke new ground. It was the very first formal, equal treaty ever signed between the Chinese Empire and any Latin American country. It was a groundbreaking geopolitical milestone.
It fundamentally established formal diplomatic relations. The two nations officially agreed to exchange formal representatives, legally setting up embassies in Lima and Beijing. But the most crucial part of the treaty, the part that materially impacted the lives of the 100,000 men we've been discussing, was its devastating legal effect on the coolie trade.
Yes. The Treaty of Tientsin was the final, definitive death knell for the coolie system.
Boom.
It explicitly, legally, and permanently ended the trafficking of contracted laborers from China to Peru. The entire predatory system of forced, deceptive contracts was legally abolished by international law.
And it had mechanisms to enforce it.
Right. The treaty contained strict mechanisms to ensure that the pig herders could never reactivate the pipeline.
But it didn't just stop future trafficking. It actively reached backward to protect the people who were already trapped in the nightmare in Peru.
Which is amazing.
The treaty legally mandated that the Chinese immigrants already living and working in Peru were to be treated as absolute equals to Peruvian citizens. Overnight, they were legally granted civil rights, protection under the Peruvian judicial system, and total freedom of movement. And, incredibly, the treaty forced the Peruvian government to officially commit to paying the return ocean passage for any Chinese immigrant who wished to leave the haciendas and go back to their homeland.
And if we connect this specific treaty to the bigger geopolitical picture of the late 19th century, the Treaty of Tientsin represents a profound moment of shifting power dynamics.
Let's unpack that.
For China, it wasn't just about ending an abusive labor practice in a distant land. It was the Qing Empire actively, successfully flexing its diplomatic muscle on the world stage to protect the human rights of its citizens globally.
It was a warning?
It was a clear, legally binding statement that Chinese lives were not mere commodities to be bought and sold by foreign powers.
And for Peru?
For Peru, it was a harsh, necessary reckoning. They were essentially forced by the weight of international pressure and the threat of economic isolation to modernize their human rights standards.
Grow up as a country.
Basically, if Peru wanted to sit at the adults' table of international trade, they could no longer operate a shadow economy built entirely on human trafficking. The treaty forced Peru to mature as a modern nation-state.
The treaty officially went into effect in March of 1876. And with that stroke of a diplomat's pen, the surviving Chinese coolies men, who had been treated as literal beasts of burden for decades, beaten and starved suddenly, legally became free workers.
Right.
They could drop their machetes and walk away from the sugar plantations. They could start their own lives. But, as history constantly reminds us, a piece of paper can change the law overnight, but it does not instantly change the deeply ingrained prejudices of a society.
That is the tragic reality of legal emancipation. Legal freedom on paper is very rarely the same as immediate social acceptance.
Yeah.
The narrative transitions now to explore what happened when this massive, newly freed, highly visible Chinese community attempted to integrate into the free market and the broader, often hostile Peruvian society.
So we move into a complex era, stretching from roughly 1874 to 1930. This is the era of newfound freedom, incredible entrepreneurial enterprise, and unfortunately, intense, violent sociological backlash. Because the end of the coolie trade did not mean the end of Chinese immigration to Peru. It simply changed the fundamental nature of it. The historical sources detail the arrival of what is known as the second wave.
Yes, moving from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, particularly peaking between the years 1905 and 1909, we see a completely new type of immigrant arriving at the docks in Callao.
Who were they?
The demographic data estimates that up to 3,000 Chinese immigrants were arriving every single year during this peak period. But we must distinguish them clearly from the coolies. These men were fundamentally different.
They weren't tricked?
No. They were not signing deceptive labor contracts. They were not bound for the Guano Islands. They were voluntary free migrants who paid their own way. They were coming to Peru, specifically looking for commercial and economic opportunities in a developing nation.
They were entrepreneurs.
Yes.
They arrived with capital, or they pooled their resources and immediately began setting up vast networks of small businesses. They opened corner shops, they started neighborhood bodegas, they ran inns and small restaurants called fondas. They were rapidly, efficiently weaving themselves into the daily, granular economic life of the country. And as we track this, we see very specific geographic patterns emerge regarding exactly where they chose to settle and build these businesses.
The geography of their settlement largely followed the geographical ghosts of the forced labor that had initially brought them there.
Like the plantations.
Right. For instance, the North Coast areas like Lambayeque, La Libertad, and Ancash. Because this specific coastal region had such a massively high concentration of the original sugar and cotton haciendas, a very large number of the freed coolies simply chose to stay in the general area once their contracts were voided.
They built communities there.
They formed deep-rooted, economically vibrant communities in the coastal valleys, opening shops and dominating local commerce in expanding towns like Chiclayo, Trujillo, and Chimbote.
But the ultimate destination, the real, undeniable center of gravity for the community's economic and cultural life, was the capital city of Lima and its adjacent port, Callao.
Naturally.
When the rural contracts expired, thousands upon thousands of men flocked directly to the capital city looking for wage work, commercial opportunities, and the safety of a larger community. And they began to strategically congregate in a very specific, densely packed area right near Lima's central market, around a street that would become famously known as Calle Capón.
And this urban congregation is profoundly historic. The settlement around Calle Capón led directly to the birth of the Barrio Chino in Lima.
Which is famous now.
And we should note, this is not just any Chinatown. It is officially the oldest Chinatown in all of Latin America.
Really?
Yes. It incredibly quickly evolved into a vibrant, bustling, neon-lit hub of commerce, food, and culture. To give you a clear sense of how incredibly quickly they established a firm cultural foothold in the city, The historical records note that by 1878, which is just 2 years after the coolie trade officially ended and before the War of the Pacific even began, the Chinese community in Lima had already funded, built, and was actively operating their own traditional theater right in the heart of the Barrio Chino.
Which is an incredible testament to resilience. It shows a community that, despite decades of trauma, is desperate to reconnect with its artistic roots, to celebrate its heritage, and to build a safe, communal haven.
Absolutely.
But let's pull back and look at the broader sociological dynamic at play here, because I see a pattern forming that is tragically, repetitively familiar in the history of global immigration across centuries.
A very familiar cycle.
Think about the classic, almost inevitable immigrant cycle. A marginalized, often racially despised group is brought into a country specifically to perform the brutal, menial, dangerous labor that the dominant society refuses to do.
Right.
They start at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. But then, through sheer grit, relentless hard work, high savings rates, and intense communal financial support, they slowly begin to carve out a niche for themselves in the free market.
They work their way up.
They transition from laborers to shop owners, merchants, and small business people. They achieve a level of highly visible economic success. And almost inevitably, the moment they achieve that visible upward mobility, the dominant society reacts with a violent, xenophobic backlash.
Because they're suddenly a threat.
Exactly. They are suddenly perceived not as necessary disposable labor, but as a direct economic threat to the local population.
And that is precisely the dangerous socio-political dynamic that unfolded in the streets of Peru. The formal legal freedom granted by the Treaty of Tientsin did absolutely nothing to erase the deeply ingrained, systemic racial prejudice held by the Peruvian elite and the working classes.
The law changed, but people didn't.
We have to contextualize the intellectual climate of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Peruvian upper classes, the politicians, and the academics were heavily toxically influenced by European pseudoscientific racism.
Social Darwinism.
Yes. They subscribed to ideas of social Darwinism that explicitly, academically categorized Asian peoples as biologically and culturally inferior. The Chinese immigrants, despite their economic contributions, were viewed with intense suspicion, constantly mocked with racist caricatures in the popular press, and subjected to daily, grinding institutional discrimination.
And that discrimination, that simmering toxic resentment over Chinese economic mobility and success, eventually boiled over into open, horrific violence. The historical timeline points to a very dark, incredibly violent turning point in the year 1909.
The year 1909 was a period of profound tragedy and terror for the community. Societal tensions had been steadily escalating, deliberately fueled by inflammatory xenophobic political rhetoric and deep economic anxiety among the working-class Peruvian populations in Lima, who felt they were being outcompeted.
So it exploded.
This tension culminated in violent, organized anti-Chinese riots, essentially. They were urban pogroms in the streets of Lima. Angry, violent mobs deliberately and systematically targeted the Barrio Chino and any Chinese-owned businesses scattered throughout the city.
That's awful.
Shops were completely looted, traditional fondas were burned to the ground, and innocent people were brutally attacked in the streets.
It is the ultimate heartbreaking betrayal by the very society they had literally built with their bare hands. They build the railroads that connect the nation. They save the agricultural export economy from collapse. They establish the local neighborhood businesses. And their reward is having their shops looted and burned by their neighbors.
It highlights a very tragic paradox regarding the geography of their settlement. The intense concentration of the community in areas like Calle Capon was a distinct double-edged sword.
How so?
On one hand, the Barrio Chino provided a vital, absolutely necessary sanctuary. It was a cultural and physical hub where they could speak their language freely, practice their customs without mockery, and economically protect each other.
Right. Safety in numbers.
But on the other hand, that intense geographic concentration made them highly dangerously visible. Because they were geographically segregated into a few city blocks, the Barrio Chino became an incredibly easy, clearly defined physical target for xenophobic mobs and racist politicians looking for a convenient scapegoat for the nation's economic woes.
The sheer scale of the violence in 1909 forced the respective governments to react diplomatically. That same year, Peru and China signed the Porus-Wu-Ting-Fang Agreement. This was essentially a diplomatic attempt to regulate the flow of migration and ostensibly offer some nominal legal protection to the immigrants. But the sociological damage was already done.
Hostility was entrenched.
The hostility from the Peruvian state apparatus and the broader society only hardened and became more institutionalized over the next 2 decades. The once massive flow of immigration slowed to a tiny trickle, heavily hampered by complex, restrictive new regulations, quotas, and outright corruption at the ports.
And the final definitive blow, the official slamming of the legal door, came in 1930.
Who closed it?
The populist Peruvian president, Luis Sanchez Cerro, who was actively riding a massive wave of right-wing nationalist sentiment, officially and completely prohibited all further immigration from China. After roughly 80 years of massive world-altering demographic shifts, the legal entry point to Peru was permanently sealed.
So the door is closed. The government has essentially passed laws saying, we don't want any more of you, and we wish the ones who are here would leave.
Right.
But it was vastly too late for exclusionary politics to work. The roots had already grown far too deep into the Peruvian soil to ever be pulled up, because while the politicians in the capital were passing exclusionary laws and drafting racist editorials, the people on the ground, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the neighbors, were doing what human beings naturally do. They were living, they were adapting, and they were mixing. Which brings us to arguably the most beautiful, enduring, and triumphant part of this entire history. The ultimate victory against all that systemic prejudice wasn't won in a courtroom or a treaty. It was won through complete, undeniable, delicious cultural integration. Let's talk about the blood, the wokes, and the brilliant invention of chifa.
Yes. To truly understand this cultural explosion, we have to look back at the stark demographics of that very first wave, the 100,000 coolies.
Right.
As we firmly established, that population was almost entirely composed of young men. There were virtually no Chinese women brought over to Peru during the early decades of the migration.
So they married locally.
Therefore, when these men finally achieved their freedom, when they left the haciendas and sought to build normal lives, to start families and put down roots, they naturally and necessarily intermarried with the local Peruvian population.
They married mestizo women in the towns, indigenous women from the Andean highlands, and Afro-descendant women from the coastal communities. And this widespread intermarriage created a brand new, entirely unique, beautifully blended generation of people.
This new generation proudly claims the identity of the Tusan. It is a word that is fundamentally uniquely Peruvian.
Where does it come from?
Etymologically, it derives from the Cantonese term Tusang, or the Mandarin equivalent Tushing. Translated literally, the characters mean born in this land.
Oh, I love that.
In the modern context of Peru, a Tusan is anyone of Chinese descent, regardless of the specific generation or the exact percentage of ethnic heritage. It is a unifying, powerful identity born entirely out of fusion and survival.
And the scale of the Tucson community today is just staggering. We mentioned it at the top of the discussion, but it bears repeating now that we know the history. We are talking about 1 to 3 million Peruvians today, up to 15% of the total population.
That's massive.
They didn't just assimilate into the background, they became a foundational pillar of modern Peruvian genetics and national identity. But if there is one single, undeniable legacy that proves how deeply this fusion penetrated the national soul, it is the food. It is the phenomenon of chifa.
Chifa is, without question, arguably the most famous and universally beloved culinary tradition in Peru today.
What does the word mean?
The word itself is a linguistic adaptation. It comes from the Cantonese phrase chifan, which quite simply means to eat rice or to have a meal. When the Chinese cooks would call out to the workers that it was time to eat, the locals heard chifa, and the name stuck to the cuisine itself.
Here is where it gets really interesting for me. I want to explore the mechanics of this.
Let's do it.
How does a cuisine that was literally born out of sheer desperation, born from impoverished, traumatized immigrants who didn't even have access to their basic traditional ingredients, how does that improvised cuisine manage to completely conquer an entire nation and become its ultimate, universally beloved comfort food?
It conquered the nation through the sheer, brilliant genius of culinary improvisation and necessary adaptation.
Okay, break it down for us.
The history of chifa begins right there in the crowded streets of the Barrio Chino, in the small, smoky inns and fondas of Calle Capón. The newly freed Chinese cooks desperately wanted to recreate the comforting flavors of Canton, but they were completely deprived of their original, authentic ingredients.
They didn't have their stuff.
Right, they didn't have their specific leafy greens, their complex spices, or their traditional sauces. So they began an incredible, improvised culinary dialogue with the local environment. They took ancient, thousands of years old Chinese cooking techniques, specifically the mastery of high heat, and applied them directly to indigenous Peruvian ingredients.
They started using the local Peruvian ají peppers to generate heat instead of the Szechuan peppercorns they couldn't find. They incorporated ancient Andean potatoes and native corn into stir-fries. They even started playing with the coastal ceviche, adding new flavor profiles.
It's pure fusion.
And at the exact same time, they were slowly, steadily introducing Chinese staples that would forever alter the Peruvian pantry. They introduced quillon, which is what Peruvians now universally call ginger. They brought siao, the dark soy sauce that provides the umami backbone to so many dishes. They introduced holantao, the crisp snow pea. They essentially cross-pollinated two of the greatest agricultural traditions on Earth.
By the 1920s, this improvisational survivalist street food had evolved into a distinct, highly formalized, and incredibly popular culinary genre.
Restaurants started opening up.
The first formal sit-down restaurants, proudly using the name chifa, began to open in the Barrio Chino, attracting not just the Tusan community, but wealthy Peruvians as well. The historical sources highlight the restaurant Kong Tong, founded in 1921, as a major pioneer in this formalization. And out of these specific kitchens came iconic, legendary dishes that simply do not exist in China, nor do they exist in traditional pre-19th century Peruvian cuisine. They are purely, entirely Tusan inventions.
Dishes like arroz chofa, which is the brilliant Peruvian take on Chinese fried rice, usually heavily dosed with soy sauce and local meats. But the absolute king of this fusion, the dish that every single Peruvian considers a point of intense, untouchable national pride, is lomo saltado.
Oh yes, it's strips of beef, red onions, tomatoes, and French fries. But the magic, the actual soul of the dish, isn't the ingredients, it's the technique.
Exactly. Lomo saltado is fundamentally defined by the physics of the wok. The high heat, incredibly fast stir-frying technique, the woke, which translates poetically to the breath of the wok, was brought directly to Peru by the Cantonese cooks.
That's smoky flavor.
Yes. The intense heat causes rapid Maillard reactions. The way the beef is seared in seconds, the way the soy sauce and vinegar caramelize and smoke in the hot iron pan that is pure Chinese culinary technology applied masterfully to Peruvian ingredients.
That's amazing.
The wok transformed the potato and the beef. Today, the integration is so absolute that there are an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 dedicated chifa restaurants spread across every single corner of Peru, from the smallest Andean villages to the most expensive neighborhoods in Lima. It is ubiquitous. So, synthesizing all of this, chifa and the broader Tucson identity really represent the perfect sociological melting pot. It's not just a cool, trendy culinary fusion that tastes good on a Friday night. It is a living, breathing, daily testament to human adaptation, to survival against insurmountable odds.
It truly is.
It proves that culture isn't a stagnant, rigid museum piece. It is incredibly fluid. It evolves constantly and beautifully when people are forced to share a space, navigate prejudice, and figure out how to live together.
It is a beautiful, enduring synthesis. And the profound influence extends even beyond the wok and the restaurant. The Chinese immigrants fundamentally altered the landscape of Peruvian agriculture.
Oh, how so?
They introduced advanced, highly efficient techniques for planned rice cultivation and water management in the arid coastal valleys. Before their arrival, rice was not a primary staple of the local diet.
Wait,
Really? And today, a mound of perfectly cooked white rice is the absolute bedrock of the daily Peruvian meal. They also successfully introduced numerous vegetables that are now considered totally native to the local markets, like pak choy and su choy. They re-engineered the soil and the diet simultaneously.
And culturally, the modern Tucson community has fought incredibly hard to fiercely preserve its ancient roots while firmly, proudly embracing its Peruvian identity. Groups like the Association Peruano-China, or APCH, founded in 1999, are central to this ongoing cultural preservation. If you go to the streets of Lima during the Lunar New Year today, you will see spectacular, colorful lion dances winding through the streets of Calle Capon, often accompanied by Catholic devotions. You see the widespread mainstream practice of feng shui, the utilization of traditional Chinese medicine in local pharmacies, and the intense popularity of martial arts like kung fu and tai chi. It is a fully integrated, fiercely proud dual identity.
We've explored how the people fused together on the ground, how the intermingled bloodlines and the adapted food created an entirely new cultural reality. But there is one final crucial piece of this historical puzzle.
The modern governments.
Exactly. How did the nations themselves, the massive state governments, evolve? How did Peru and China move from the hostility the human trafficking and the diplomatic crises of the 19th century, to becoming the massive, intertwined, globalized strategic partners they are today in the 21st century.
That is a fascinating transition. We are moving from the era of the coolie to the modern era of the geopolitical strategic partner. And it's actually wild to think that this relationship has historical roots even deeper than the 1849 arrival of the Frederick Wilhelmsen.
Yes.
The historical sources point out a really fascinating little footnote. There was a colonial census taken in the Viceroyalty of Lima all the way back in the year 1613 that officially recorded 40 Chinese individuals living in the city, having likely arrived via the complex Manila galleon trade routes operated by the Spanish. So the trans-Pacific connection is genuinely ancient. But the modern political relationship is a wild roller coaster ride.
It certainly is a volatile timeline. After the fall of the ancient Qing dynasty in 1911 and the subsequent establishment of the Republic of China, diplomatic relations remained relatively normal and stable. But the dawn of the Cold War massively complicated everything on the global stage.
Of course.
In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces took definitive control of mainland China, establishing the People's Republic of China, while the defeated nationalist government fled across the strait to the island of Taiwan. The entire global community was deeply fractured over which government to officially, legally recognize as the true China.
And Peru, being firmly entrenched in the United States' sphere of geopolitical influence during the height of the Cold War, naturally aligned with the West's stance. They maintained official diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in Taiwan for decades, completely freezing out the mainland.
But then comes a radical, unexpected geopolitical pivot. And this happens under a very specific, historically complex regime.
Who was in charge?
The timeline pivots sharply on November 2, 1971. The left-wing nationalist military government of General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who had taken power in a coup, made a decisive, historic shift in foreign policy.
What did he do?
Acting independently of U.S. pressure, he officially broke relations with Taiwan and formally recognized the People's Republic of China in Beijing as the sole legitimate representative of the Chinese people. Peru became one of the very first nations in all of Latin America to take this bold diplomatic step, deeply altering the geopolitical landscape of the region and opening a massive new door.
And that single, calculated diplomatic decision unlocked the door for a bilateral economic relationship that would just absolutely explode over the next few decades. Fast forward to the 1990s. The president of Peru is Alberto Fujimori. Now, Fujimori is of Japanese descent, but he possessed a very keen, highly strategic understanding of the rapidly rising economic power of the Asian markets. Under his administration, bilateral trade between Peru and China skyrocketed. The economic data from the sources shows trade jumping from a mere $94.9 million to over $704.6 million in a relatively short span.
That initial trade boom in the 90s laid the essential groundwork for the monumental multi-billion-dollar agreements of the 21st century. The defining moment of the modern economic era occurred in 2009 with the official signing of the Free Trade Agreement between Peru and China.
That was a huge deal.
It was signed in Beijing by the Peruvian Minister Mercedes Arauz and the Chinese Vice Minister Yi Xiaozun, and it officially went into effect in 2010. At the time of its signing, it was noted as the most comprehensive, far-reaching, and complex trade agreement China had ever signed with any Latin American nation.
And from there, the diplomatic titles and the handshakes just kept getting loftier and more significant. In 2008, under Peruvian President Alan Garcia and Chinese President Hu Jintao during the APEC summit hosted in Lima, they officially elevated the relationship to a strategic partnership. Then, just a few years later in 2013, under President Ollanta Humala and President Xi Jinping, the relationship was elevated to the maximum possible diplomatic level, a comprehensive strategic partnership.
And the current real-world economic statistics heavily reflect the gravity of those diplomatic titles. Today, China is undisputedly, by a massive margin, Peru's #1 global trading partner, accounting for roughly 23% of the country's total international trade.
That's almost a quarter of all trade.
Furthermore, China is the absolute top foreign investor in the Peruvian state. Their capital is deeply, inextricably embedded in the Peruvian economy, particularly in the massive, highly lucrative mining sector. Huge, state-backed Chinese enterprises like Shugang, Chinalco, and Jinsao operate massive, multi-billion-dollar extraction projects deep in the Andes, pulling out the copper and minerals that feed the modern global economy.
I just want to pause and point out the incredible, almost dizzying historical arc we have just traversed over the last hour. Think about exactly where we started.
Yeah.
We started in an era where Peru literally had to send a naval captain on a month-long voyage across the ocean to grovel and apologize to the emperor for engaging in the horrific, deadly human trafficking of Chinese citizens. And today we are in an era where these two nations are locked in a maximum-level, mutually dependent, multi-billion-dollar economic partnership that literally sustains the modern Peruvian economy. It is a complete, unimaginable 180-degree turn.
This raises an important question, a fascinating observation about the underlying nature of international relations and statecraft. If we critically examine the political timeline we just discussed, we see a distinct, undeniable pattern. Pure economic pragmatism, completely and utterly transcending domestic political ideology.
How so?
Look closely at the specific Peruvian leaders who actively deepen this relationship. You have General Velasco in the 1970s, a left-wing nationalist military dictator who initiated the ties with communist Beijing.
Okay.
Then you have Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s, a right-wing neoliberal populist who massively expanded the capitalist trade. And then you have a succession of modern democratic presidents from various opposing points on the political spectrum actively signing free trade agreements and comprehensive strategic partnerships.
They all did it.
Regardless of their deep, often bitter ideological differences domestically, every single one of these leaders looked across the Pacific Ocean and recognized the undeniable, absolute strategic necessity of binding Peru's economic future to China's rise. Economic pragmatism won every single time.
That is a brilliant point to highlight. The money, the minerals, and the mutual economic need always, eventually, paved over the political and ideological divides. As we wrap up this incredible deep dive, I want to take a moment to just synthesize everything we've talked about today.
Let's do it.
Because when you stack all the history, the pain, and the culinary triumphs together, there is a profound, almost heartbreaking irony to this entire narrative. The economist Jose Tam, who is quoted directly in the source material, sums it up perfectly. This entire story is so much more than just a fun culinary influence or an interesting historical footnote. It is blood. It is the literal building of a nation.
The irony he points out is stark and undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
These men, those 80,000 to 100,000 young men from Canton, arrived in chains. They were deceived, trapped by fraudulent contracts, and violently thrust into a physical environment that was fundamentally indistinguishable from the chattel slavery that had just been outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
They were beaten, they were starved, and they were literally worked to death on islands of toxic excrement. When they finally earned their freedom, they faced violent urban pogroms, institutionalized racism, and exclusionary government laws explicitly designed to erase them from the national landscape.
And yet, despite all of that immense suffering, despite a legal and social system that was literally designed from the ground up to crush them into the dirt and extract their labor until they died, they ended up building the modern nation.
They really did.
They gave Peru its daily staple of rice. They invented its most beloved, iconic national dish, the lomo saltado. They laid the steel rails that physically connected the coast to the mountains. And most importantly, they gave the nation up to 3 million descendants who actively carry the resilience, the intelligence, and the deep culture of those first pioneers in their DNA today.
There is a physical monument in Lima that perfectly captures this hard-won victory. In 1971, at the main entrance to the historic Calle Capón in Lima's Barrio Chino, a massive 8-meter-tall traditional arch, a paifang, was erected.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Carved deeply into that arch is a quote from the ancient philosopher Confucius. Translated, it reads, "Under the same sky, we are all equal." It stands there today, towering over the bustling street, as a daily, permanent reminder of a community that survived the unimaginable and firmly demanded their equality.
Under the same sky, we are all equal. That is incredibly powerful, and it brings me right back to the complex nature of history itself. We often want history to be clean, categorical, and simple. But it's muddy. It's incredibly complex. The story of Peru isn't just a binary textbook story of Spanish conquerors and indigenous empires.
Not at all.
It is a vastly more complex, incredibly rich story of global economic forces, desperate trans-Pacific migrations, and profound human resilience. So I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something to explore on your own as you go about your week. If a community of incredibly marginalized, trafficked laborers can quietly, persistently shape up to 15% of a nation's DNA, fundamentally alter its agricultural landscape, and entirely invent its modern culinary identity, despite starting in chains, what other invisible, forgotten migrations have quietly engineered the cultures that we today consider to be rigidly, inherently traditional?
It's a great question.
When you look at the food on your plate, the words in your local slang, or the faces in your city, what hidden histories of survival, pain, and ultimate fusion are you completely missing?
It fundamentally changes the way you look at the world around you, and it certainly changes the way you understand the concept of a nation. It's a powerful reminder to always question the origins of the traditions we so easily take for granted.
Yes, and that is exactly why we dig into these stories. So the next time you sit down to enjoy a massive plate of Ras Shofa or grab some takeout from a local spot, I hope you consider the incredible 175-year journey of resilience, adaptation, and sheer grit that brought those exact flavors to your table.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for joining us as we unpacked this incredible history. Keep learning, keep questioning what you think you know, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.